policy forum, when we use the word policy here, we're talking about policy in terms of what we do at an organisational level, what we do across our nations, what we do within our organisations, what we do in terms of our policy as it actually manifests itself in our practices. So we're talking about policy at many different levels here, which I think will become apparent as we introduce our panel, and I introduce the panel, and we start to get into the reflections on the recommendations and what's led to them. So, without further ado, you have biogs of all the panelists in your conference documents, so I'm going to be quite quick. Chris, we've already met, Associate in Human Economics and Digital Advisory to many institutes, including National Gallery, BFI, and others as well. I know that you've worked with in the past. We have, I'm going to do it in panel order. So we have Julian Richards, who is Professor of Archaeology at the University of York and Founding Director of the Archaeological Data Service. Obviously, you've seen Julian already speak in relation to Unpath Waters. Julian is also involved in the Heritage Science Data Service, which is part of the AHRC Riches Infrastructure in Heritage Science, if you're familiar with that. Julian is part of that activity. Next to Julian, we have Bridget Vezina. I hope I've got that right, Bridget. And Bridget is Director of Policy and Open Culture at Creative Commons, which hopefully you all know, promotes access to cultural heritage worldwide. I know Brigitte has also worked quite a lot in terms of the legal context with the World Intellectual Property Organisation and many other organisations in an advisory capacity as well. Next to Brigitte, we have Tom Crick, who in an ever-diminishing part of his day job is Professor of Digital Policy and Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor at Swansea University, and of course is Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. We have, who have we got next? We've got Josie, who is Josie Fraser, who is Head of Digital Policy at the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And Josie's work, she can correct me if I get this wrong, is very much around supporting digital projects with a focus on accessibility, inclusion, and thinking about skills and digital investments for the future. And next to Josie, we have JD Hill, who is Head of Research at the British Museum and has played an important role, as many other representatives across the cultural and heritage organisations have, in terms of shaping initiatives, including towards the National Collection. And of course, you have already heard from JD in terms of the Sloan Lab Discovery Project, of which he is part as well. Okay, that is the intros over. Right, I'm going to ask 3 open-ish questions I'll direct them to some of our panel members, and then I've got some more specific questions. And if we've got time, I'd like to ask a key closing question. So I'm going to start with what are the most relevant recommendations for the work of your organisation or sector? And I wanted to really get different perspectives on this. So I'll start with you, JD. What does this mean for British Museum and the sector at large as you've consulted over the years on this programme?
Thank you, Alan. I don't want to pick out any one of the recommendations because I think the important point here is that we haven't got now one set small individual recommendations. We have a whole suite of a joined up ecology for us to work for. And I think that's really a powerful thing to have. It's a powerful thing to have because the way this policy document is being put together so carefully, and I really want to acknowledge the care which has gone into this, I hope means that we can go to our bosses and say to them, here is some very, very clear sense of what you now have to do to make sure that all of our organisations can achieve what we all individually want to achieve. I think the key here is that it's not just us about coming together collectively. There's enough in this document to be translated into each major organisation's priorities. And it's a very powerful document because I've already seen the usefulness of this document already in my own organisation. I can go to senior management in decisions they've been making in the previous 6 months. I can go to and say, look, this is what is now the minimum standard. These are the things which you're now going to need to do. These are the sorts of things which I am hoping our funders will now regard as the minimum standards we need to work to. And to put that in a context which perhaps our university colleagues will understand, the way in which, for example, some of the minimum standards about need for data repositories, data standards have been imposed, not imposed, suggested, required by your funders like UKRI, European Research Council, have meant that change has to happen. So in terms of form, making change happen, that's very important. But what I hope is that the document can be owned in the different ways by our different organisations so that we can actually all see our own individual paths as part of this much collective whole. That's me going on for too long.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm gonna come to so everybody gets a bit of warning. I know, Josie, this is an area that National Heritage Lottery Fund has worked in for a while, so I'm going to come to you next. But I'm then also going to ask from a more academic and international perspective if there's any views. So over to you, Josie. How do you see this working for what you do at National Heritage Lottery Fund?
Thanks ever so much. It's a bit of an end of an era, this meeting for me, because I started my job as Head of Digital Policy at the National Lottery Heritage Fund the same week that Rebecca Bailey started her job. And the first event I actually attended in any kind of responsible capacity for the Heritage Fund was the launch of Tank. So our journeys have been very, very close over the last 5 years, and we've worked together in terms of our being able to share our knowledge, our experience, the resources that we've created with the project. And obviously we've come from very, very different angles in terms of how we support heritage and what our focus is. So for those of you who don't know, the National Lottery Heritage Fund is the UK's largest funder of heritage. We support a very, very broad sector, which includes GLAM organisations, but that's only about a fifth of the types of organisations that we support across the whole of the UK. And we are really, really committed to how digital can really increase access, support preservation, and promote access to collections and to new collections. So this project's been really important to us, and the journey of it has been. We work across a sector that, just to let people know who might not be clear, because the heritage sector is a strange kind of a shaped beast anyway, but the heritage sector is around 68% either all volunteer organisations or organisations with less than 10 employees. So that really shapes the position that we're coming from and the kind of support that we want to give to the sector, but also it shapes why we think these recommendations are really important, and they're relevant across different communities and different kinds of organisation.
And I'll be coming to that whole range of size and scale of organisations. We hope we'll be able to support, with collective support, take these recommendations on board to make essentially the digital presence better than it currently is. Julian or Brigitte, is anything you wanted to add from your perspective? Julian, anything from you?
I suppose just very briefly, I agree entirely with JD that it's the whole package of things rather than singling out individual recommendations. But I think, particularly for me, the stress on preservation, but then the impact of reuse. There's no point in doing preservation unless we understand reuse. And I think that the idea that we need to look at the impact of digitisation as well, and how digital resources are used across a wide range of audiences as well. I mean, we're seeing cases where digital resources are being widely used now. The issue there is citation, though, and getting people into the right habits for that, because I think we're underestimating actually the amount of reuse.
Brigitte, I'm going to come a little bit later to the specifics around reuse, but anything in general you wanted to say about the recommendations?
I wanted to point out the fact that I'm absolutely delighted that the policy recommendations themselves are CC licensed. And it's one of the first things that you see when you flip over on the first page. It's the third line, basically. And this is not insignificant. And so, in all seriousness, I wanted to echo what JD said. It's about institutions owning these recommendations. And what better way to be able to own them if you can reuse them and adapt them to your own individual context. And I think this is the power of open licensing, is being able to empower those to use the content in ways that answer their own particular and specific needs. So I wanted to highlight this as a introduction remark. And I could go on, but I just want to for those of you who are not familiar with Creative Commons, we're the organization behind the CC licenses and tools, which are open copyright licenses that enable a more permissive sharing system for all sorts of content, including heritage. And some things that were said this morning resonated profoundly with our mission when I heard things like building digital bridges or to generate new narratives in new contexts. This is precisely what openness aims to achieve. So I'd love to elaborate further if you allow me.
We will. Tom, I was going to come to you in a second. I realised I picked up the Welsh version. So there we go. There we go. That is for you. And actually, and seriously, that is about accessibility. I wanted to ask, and I'll ask other panellists about this as well, you know, given your position in DCMS, what do you see as the benefits that we, or anything else you wanted to say, but specifically, what do you see as the benefits and the impacts that might flow from these?
No, thank you. Prynhawn, everyone, croeso cynnwys iawn. I mean, it's great to be here in the sense of kind of echoing comments from colleagues around it's the power of the community. I mean, I'm really enthused and enthusiastic about the recommendations anyway, and viewing them as all together, you recognise that they are sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for the things that we want to deliver over the kind of coming, you know, if you think about this as critical national culture and heritage infrastructure. So what does this look like for sustainable, secure, resilient capability, both for research, but also for society at large? So we recognise this as a broader impact as a public sort of kind of social good, and that really resonates with what the new Secretary of State has been saying around ensuring the accessibility and the broader impact for everyone across the UK. So, you know, I'm delighted to see all four nations represented here, and I think you think about the kind of, you've already mentioned the kind of multiple levels of kind of governance and government. I think that's really interesting when we see Devo appearing in England and what that looks like around different people and cultures and communities across the whole of the UK. I guess some of the kind of challenges around viewing this in the context of other infrastructure investments. I think there's massive opportunity around Tank Disco. We've seen the announcement of the National the National Data Library, like what this might look like as a sort of a cohering influence. I think library's really interesting. So we talk about meaningful curation and like how that is accessible and useful and usable, and what that means for different communities. And I suppose just the opportunity around the recognition that this is not a nice to have, not just a nice to have. You know, this should be a core thing that we recognise as being something that should, must, and can be funded in lots of different ways. And I think maybe it resonates with what Rowley said on the last slide. The work starts now, and actually, that's probably going to be hard work. We have to think about this in the broader, in the sort of budgetary envelopes, and we recognise that there are significant calls on research and innovation funding. But actually, maybe that's partly a role for me and colleagues as being an advocate for driving this through when we talk about investments in R&D or science and research more broadly. Is our collective sectors don't get forgotten about, and we can talk about this in the broader, this is a key national research investment, or it's a huge investment for society at large. So I guess that there's probably a few crumbs there to kind of pick up as we go through, but maybe there's hopefully providing some assurance from a DCMS perspective that we really wish to drive this and be an advocate for some of this wider work.
Brilliant. Yeah, indeed, we'll return to some of that. Chris, you gave a really great introduction to the different recommendations, and I guess just to check in on that benefits, there's a lot of case studies in the report. What's the range of benefits that you sort of saw through that in terms of, in broad terms, innovation, community-driven, social?
I mean, for this to be meaningful, it has to be useful across society, across the economy, and across the generation of knowledge in research. Those three things have to be meaningful for this to be meaningful. And I think we can, in the research behind this, you can see the absolute criticality of digital collections in our understanding of society. You can see that the way that new forms of community data have been integrated into TANK have unlocked, I think, knowledge that we didn't have before and made it accessible, again, not just to arts and humanities researchers, but ultimately to all forms of research across the arts, humanities, sciences and beyond at scale. And the more those can be unlocked, the more complex questions around future of society, future of economy, and the more value can be created. So all of those things are there. But we also then, as I said, have to find those applications in near-term innovation. What's happening close to market where cultural heritage data can be useful in making technologies better. We could think of obviously examples like generative AI, other emerging technologies which have complex ethical requirements where only arts and humanities data, cultural heritage data can really probably help unpick and unstick some of those things. So, again, that utility is there right across everything. It's not just all about money. It's all about that wide application of benefits, social, economic and beyond. So, I think it's absolutely, no question, that's absolutely there.
Yeah, and I think we saw that in many talks over the last 2 days. I was struck today, for example, by On Pathwaters and looking at how that is not. It's about combining data from very different areas, from shipping, through weather, through commercial data, through heritage data, and thinking about how can we use the heritage aspect of this to add value, not just to heritage, but to other sectors as well. But obviously, heritage is the most important bit of that ecosystem for me personally. I just wanted to check any other comments on the benefits before I move on. Is there anything anybody else wanted to say on that? We'll revisit some of it again. Josie, you look like you're about to say something.
Can I just jump in? It was really in Lorna's keynote yesterday morning. I guess I was really struck by the power of the diverse kind of citizen's voice. I think that really comes through in the number of kind of talks and sessions over the last kind of 2 days. So, when we've spoken, I guess the sector speaks about this quite a lot in the sense of the kind of co-creation, the participatory, the kind of engagement aspects, and especially when you have hyper-local kind of context to stuff. I guess that's something that to really kind of mainstream and keep visible and present all the way through. So there are always challenges with doing this. There's lots of colleagues here who are very well steeped in these types of research and interacting and liaising with citizens and diverse kind of community groups. But I guess that is so powerful, and again that really resonates with some of the language coming from Secretary of State and from government more broadly when we do talk about things like the missions. I'm not here to kind of talk about the government missions, but when you think about cohesive communities and recognizing the divisions in society and how you can address some of these, and it's intrinsically place-based, that's a really nice angle. And this is, I guess there are huge benefits to align with prevailing government policy, but I guess it's also the right thing to do. So, you know, it's mutually beneficial, and you can tap into that wider policy context. But again, this is very citizen and civic centred, which I think is really, really powerful.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I've been given a question which says, what would you most like to see funded to help organisations deliver on these recommendations? The obvious answer is everything. I'd like everything to be funded, but unfortunately we're probably not going to be able to do that immediately. But anybody wanted to talk on that question, Brigitte?
I'd love to, yeah. So I think what's important and in the purpose that was read out by Rebecca and in the presentation that we just had over the policy recommendations, I would like to have an emphasis on the word accessible. That the purpose is to have a collection that is accessible to everyone. And here I'll tap into my experience as a lawyer in human rights. And access to cultural heritage is actually a fundamental human right. It's enshrined in Article 27, Paragraph 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talks about the right to participate in cultural life, but there cannot be any meaningful participation if there isn't meaningful access. And I'm very pleased to see that this has taken prominence in the policy recommendations. What we see also in the digital environment is that it has been able to remove a lot of barriers to access. Think about geographic barriers, for example. I think that's a good example that digitization enables people to bring people to the collections and also to bring the collections to people. But what we see also is that digital brings its own set of barriers. And I think it's really important for these policy recommendations to recognize that there are still these barriers, and in order to overcome them, we have to take a very thoughtful approach, which encompasses the access dimension. And so in terms of economic barriers, we can think of the high fees sometimes that are associated with access to cultural heritage in digital formats. Technological barriers when the heritage is only made as a low resolution or behind technological protection measures, or the kind of legal or contractual barriers when reproductions of public domain works are issued but with a claim of copyright over them, which is not justified in view of the fact that it is a faithful reproduction. So we're seeing these new barriers emerging, and I think it's really important to read the recommendations in that context to help remove those barriers if we want to achieve digital equity. And so I would emphasize the need to fund sustainable projects, just not one-off. I think it was mentioned a few times, the long-term view that we need to adopt in this context, that are public and community-oriented and centered. This was often mentioned again, and with open access as one of its core pillars in all corners of the UK, because we know that there can be so many benefits of open access, and they're often not touted enough. I just want to echo this morning, Megan told us that GLAM practitioners are not dinosaurs. And it's no coincidence that we at Creative Commons issued a publication called Don't Be a Dinosaur, and embrace all the benefits of open access. Otherwise, there is a risk that if the collections are not accessible, the institutions themselves can become irrelevant.
Okay, but some institutions do indeed have dinosaurs in them, so don't worry, just a bad joke. I was going to ask around about any more points on funding, and I'm going to come to Julian about international funding opportunities, but just wanted to check, Chris, in terms of the recommendations and how to help organisations at different points, or maybe at the start of this process. Are the recommendations considered sequentially? I mean, how should people frame these when they're thinking about what do I need to do first? What do I need to try and ask for support or money on?
Well, inevitably, JD, I used to share an office with JD many years ago, and he always says things in much nicer words than I can ever get to. What JD said about being a kind of ecosystem, that's absolutely right. This kind of started, the very early first draft of this started as a kind of linear flow, and it isn't. You don't start at the beginning and get to the end. It is a sequence of things which are interconnected in a kind of, as I said, a kind of ecosystem where do all of them if you can. Of course you can, and there are things that can be kind of, open sourced and remixed and revised to be useful to you. But across that whole ecosystem is where all of the value of this is constrained. But for different organisations doing different things, some will be more than others. You know, for some it's about early stage process, that selection question. What's the first thing I digitise in my collection? For JD, where you've already got 4 million things digitised, is, well, what do you do next? And so the questions are inherently different depending upon status. But the thing that gives me most hope from what we've heard already is that if JD, with one of the biggest digital collections in the world that needs to double in size, and if the Heritage Lottery Fund that works with so many small organisations that might only be beginning, if this is useful in both of those cases, then we're kind of doing the right thing.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Any on this side of the panel wanted to add any more to this point? No? Okay, good. I will ask Julian. I think from a personal level, I can see there is a lot of opportunity through Horizon Europe. We hopefully are now in a different political scenario now where we can engage, and we definitely can engage. And I'm conscious that there'll be organisations here who will just have no idea how to engage with it, and the barriers to be able to put in or be part of a proposal. Anything you wanted to reflect on in that regard, Julian?
I think the international dimension of this is really important, for not just as a source of funding, but because the endeavour is a collective international and European endeavour as well. We're talking about a national collection, but we saw with Unpath Waters, you rapidly leave the UK coastal waters, and there are wrecks of British ships around the world. That may seem a trivial example, but a lot of research questions from an academic context, you need to not just search the databases of a single country. So that's where I think that European dimension becomes particularly important. It's a confusing landscape, but it's important to be aware of the opportunities, and for the UK to take a lead in trying to get hold of those, and also take the lead in some of those projects. I mean, at the moment, there are probably sort of 4 key areas where we can be working. First of all, there's the ERICs, the European Research International Collaborations, legal entities that are now funded as infrastructure through Europe. Now, it's great. I mean, the UK already subscribes to Clarin, which is the languages one, which has a relevance here in the sort of heritage sector. It's fantastic that we're likely to be signing up to ERIS, the European Research Infrastructure for Heritage Science, and that's really timely with the Riches programme, and it allows us to take a lead in developing this heritage science data service, and the Riches will be the UK hub for ERIS. So there are opportunities there as well. We're not yet a member of DARIA, which is the arts and humanities, but we need to think about opportunities for collaboration there. So that's the research infrastructures. Secondly, there's the European data spaces, which Europeana is one of the leading examples. Europeana, in a way, was a sort of a European tank trying to do the same as we're doing for the UK, but at a European level. There's further funding likely to be forthcoming in that area that institutions of all shapes and sizes can contribute to. The Museums Data Service is very relevant in that context as well. There's the European Open Science Cloud. I'm sorry, this is acronym soup. It is, but this is probably more of a process that towards open data, and links very much with the sort of Creative Commons licensing as well. But saying that all our science and research data should become open. There are opportunities to develop hubs for EOS. There's a call out for that at the moment. And then, as you yourself mentioned earlier, I think the latest initiative of this, but 80 million euros of initiative, is the European Collaborative Cloud for Cultural Heritage, where already a project Echoes is now, over the next 5 years, developing this European infrastructure for cultural heritage. The UK is in there through ADS and the National Gallery, but there is a call out now at the moment for 10 new projects to be funded, 5 calls, deadline in January, and then there'll be a further call for another 10 projects within the lifetime of ECCCH. So this is, it's a
It's
key
complicated
area.
as well,
It's
isn't it?
complicated,
So-
difficult to navigate, but it's important to look out and the support available from UKRO
Yeah.
to help with these, and indeed from HRC as well.
Yeah. Okay, so go to JD.
Just to make a very quick point, when we talk about who are we making this accessible for, it isn't just the UK. You know, our collections, because of our colonial and imperial histories, are global connections. You know, we need to be thinking about how we make our collections accessible to everyone around the world. You know, Rebecca Bailey and I had the privilege of being in Australia last year, where they're thinking about building something similar to Tank. But in Australia, if you're an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, yes, your collections, some of them are in Australia, but they're dispersed across the whole of Australia, and your collections and material dispersed across the whole of the world. You know, Disco is working at a global level. You know, and I think we need to think...
That's the digitisation of scientific... I can't remember the exact...
Natural history collections,
Yeah.
basically. No, and when we're thinking about this accessibility question, let's not just think UK... Not that I'm saying that's not important, but let's remember we have global responsibilities to make our collections accessible.
That's a really good point, JD, and we might return to that. Well, I'm going to let Tom... Oh, go on then. You go,
I'll
Josie.
just pitch in really quickly with one point about, given that we're talking about global infrastructure and networks, just to, you know, underline the importance of Creative Commons licensing as part of the infrastructure that makes this work, and also the Wikimedia projects and communities that are global, that are sustainable, and that are, you know, providing everybody with a magnificent example of how actually you can plan for the future in different ways. So I just wanted to add
indeed.
to the mix of the different types of infrastructure that we're all working with and around.
Again, that's a really good point. There are things out there already that are inclusive and have lower bars to entry than some of the things we've been talking about in terms of complicated funding structures. Tom, you've been waiting to come in on this. Or?
I don't know, it'll probably be quite a boring point now after those useful points. I mean, just to kind of echo what Julian said around fully endorsing the kind of the call to, that's the kind of call to arms, call to action piece around the potential with Horizon Europe and looking into FP10 going forwards. I mean, I think if you saw the recent kind of budget announcement around the overall kind of R&D, kind of total R&D in the budget, and kind of what that means for sort of UK R&I more broadly. I mean, I think, you know, ultimately a lot of money is going into participation into Horizon Europe and what that might mean beyond. I guess that is, we want to absolutely ensure, and this is a role for DCMS for me, and certainly for across the kind of across government, and certainly for providing the opportunity for IROs, PSREs, and all bodies to be able to meaningfully participate in some of these programs, is that they are there and we are desperate to allow you all to engage in them. So that kind of capacity and capability to tap into these major European funding programs, to leverage existing UK infrastructure or, you know, research investments, but actually, you know, building on those points around this is a European, this is a global endeavour. We have world-leading research, we have world-leading organisations here. We can and should be participating in and leading some of these, you know, some of the the cluster work across Horizon Europe. So that's something that I guess that's where we can help facilitate that and ensure there is the capacity and capability in IROs and PSREs, but also how can UKRI, AHRC, UKRO, British Academy, there's kind of pump prime pots of money to be able to build those networks and build that capacity and capability. So I guess please do it, and like, how can we better help support that?
Okay, so I'm going to twist a question that I had a little bit, which was around how independent research organisations, so those large, for this purposes of this panel, those larger institutes, cultural heritage institutes that have that status with UKRI, can embed these recommendations in their digital plans and activities. So I'm going to come to you a little bit on that, JD, is actually how can, as we've seen in this programme, how can we ensure some equitable partnerships across those larger organisations that aren't overly, I can't think of another term, paternalistic, to enable a wide range of different organisations to, you know, get better at some of this stuff, wherever they are in the world, to pick up on your point again, JD, in terms of what that looks like. So I don't know who wants to take that. I mean, we could start with you, JD, but I can go elsewhere. Let's start with you.
Thank you, Alan. Let me start with an important point to make, which we might forget about Tank. One of the differences about Towards a National Collection was that this is an initiative which came out of what the cultural organisations in the IRO said were our questions which need to be answered. That's a really important thing to stress. How do we now take that further and forwards? I think comes back to a fundamental question which we in the IROs need to ask our CEOs. It's a question beyond the heads of research, and it's a question of, many of our organisations run national programmes. Many of our organisations see our roles as sharing our collection, supporting local museums, partners, libraries around the museums to achieve what they want to achieve. How many of us think about helping others do that digitally? And that's over to you.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And it's been one of the great things that we've been able to contribute to this process and the development of the outcomes and the resources here. So we ran the Digital Skills for Heritage programme that lasted for 4 years and covered the lockdown period significantly as well. And that was a programme designed to support small and medium organisations tackle these really complex issues of the kind of end-to-end journey of digital heritage. So all the way from deciding what might be digitised to rights management to management of different assets and accessibility of assets. That was like a really, really important journey for us, I think. And obviously, it was important in terms of supporting people hands-on. I think we supported 53,000 individuals on that programme. And we created 888 openly licensed resources in English and Welsh. What massively, I think, we learnt from that is that skills are critical. Skills are in huge, huge demand. But unless you have the kinds of infrastructure, and I'm using that in the broadest sense of the word, to support groups and communities in engaging and creating their own heritage, it's something that's not possibly going to stick. And I think the recommendations here are all about making stuff stick, looking at where those gaps are in our heritage, in our representation, and ensuring that those are secured, because it's super ethical and it's super in terms of public value as well. It's really important that if we are investing in those things, that they do stick for the long term. So these are a great steer, I think, towards the kind of wider infrastructure that needs to be developed by a range of organisations and institutions to support that from our perspective.
Thank you. Can I ask you and Tom a question then? Am I allowed to ask questions?
Well, I was going to ask something similar, but you go first.
The real question is, many of our large organisations have national programmes. We really invest in them. We really think they're important. But certainly the ones I work with, the ones I know are still about physical access. They're still about sharing, moving collections around. They're about training and skills. To make what you have been funding sustainable, that needs to be embedded in some organisations. So, is it one of the roles of the nationals and the big regionals to be the people who should be helping deliver and drive that training and support and mentoring and be there to help and coordinate and catalyst?
Josie, do respond. I've just been given 10 minutes by Rebecca, and I wanted to get through some of the other questions.
Okay,
so,
sorry,
yeah.
I'll be brief. Yes, absolutely. It's part of our role, and we've spent the last 4 years doing a big digital skills programme. But I think the key way that we're supporting this is through the requirements we put on the digital projects we fund. Now, we fund a huge range of digital projects with many different kinds of data, many different kinds of output, many different kinds of resource created from that because of the sectors that we cover. But we ask all of our projects that create digital outputs to ensure that the work that they produce is available, and that means unfettered access to the public, accessible, and that's obviously accessible in some ways that we're familiar with, but also in the broader sense of the word. And we also require that work that's created with National Lottery Heritage funding is open as well, so openly licensed or in the public domain. And I think that's one of the ways in to that larger conversation about sustainability, about making sure that we are creating things for future generations.
And I'm going to come on to the specifics on what one specific question I wanted to cover was on reuse and rights management. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention it's not by happenstance we have the Chief Scientific Advisor from DCMS and Josie from National Heritage Lottery Fund, and of course myself representing HCRC as part of UKRI on this panel, in that I think fundamentally we need to work together collectively for a forward strategy to help support some of this and build a case for further investment. But if we've got time, we might get to some of that later on. Tom, anything you wanted to say around the recommendations from a DCMS perspective overall before we go to the more specific question on rights management?
No, I guess to echo the comments around viewing them together, I thought that's really interesting when they came through as perhaps a linear process, and then you saw them as how they interconnect and intersect. I think that's a really powerful message, particularly with things like security or secure and resilient infrastructure more broadly. I think I know we might touch upon kind of funding, but I guess there's probably this, and I'm really aware of, and I think the wider conversation has been around when you talk about sustainable funding, thinking about this both in a capex view and an opex view, I suppose. And
you might need to explain.
So I guess like capital expenditure, and then like I guess like operating expenditure, kind of revenue.
So build and people.
Yeah. So and I think we've spoken already about kind of skills, and we've spoken about I think there's been conversations around people and capability. Actually, if you think about pipeline of talent and skills and people coming into the heritage sector more broadly, it is about building and maintaining and sustaining kind of physical infrastructure or digital infrastructure, but actually very much around the kind of knowledge and capability that we need to sustain and ensure that these broader sectors can do what we want them to do. So I guess I'm very mindful of that and how we provide the kind of evidence when we talk about working in partnership and building the evidence base for this and the kind of the very strong narrative and story. This is my first spending review, which has been very, very fun, having been a 1 year and 1 day in the post of Chief Scientific Advisor. Then actually, how do we tell the story and how do we provide that rigorous evidence to get money to do the things we need to do?
Indeed. Right. Because of time, I'm going to take one more specific question, and then I'm going to ask all the panel, so it doesn't come as a surprise. What's the one thing you're going to do on the back of this conference with this policy recommendations in your hand that you think will be the next step for you as an individual? So I wanted to talk a little bit about reuse and rights management, and just in very broad terms, that we've heard from Josie on this. She's embedded in it. So I'm going to come to Brigitte and then maybe Chris as well, because I know you've worked a lot in this area. So Brigitte, your reflections on the importance and the role of this in terms of the recommendations going forward.
Yes, absolutely. Recommendation number 4 is definitely the most important from Creative Commons point of view, because if you want to foster reuse, you need to make a reuse easy and seamless and not make it cumbersome. And what happens when the heritage is not made available or accessible openly is that you create some friction, and then people asking for permission is already a huge hurdle. So what you want to do is be able to make it accessible so that people can reuse it in a very simple way without having to go through the loops and hoops of having to ask for permission. I also wanted to give a little bit more context about what we mean by openness, because we immediately think of the public domain or open licenses, but it's a whole ecosystem. There's policies, as we see, but there's also practices, and so it's important that these policies also get implemented, and that in addition to talking the talk, we're all able to walk the walk. We also conceive of openness as a means to an end, and this is often misunderstood, that we are going to push for openness at any cost. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And we've heard from JD about involving other communities from around the world. Openness has to be a means to an end, and it has to be informed by values and principles and a very clear purpose of what you want to achieve by providing access. So openness at Creative Commons also comes with a set of considerations that go beyond copyright. And this is something that Josie and I have worked together on, the ethics of open sharing, that there could be some additional considerations, and that copyright is not the only determinant factor when it comes to making things available. But what I want to emphasize is that openness is a key means to remove undue, unfair, unnecessary barriers. And so we need to look at where it can be useful to bring more equity and remove those social economic barriers in the digital environment. I want to say it's also reflected in policy number 5 on access and engagement. Openness is again a mechanism to enable people to be able to engage on a deeper level, not just view heritage, but engage and interact and participate in its transmission.
Yeah, and I realise it's not a binary, it's either closed or open. There are lots of things in between, and we heard about that in depth in some of the presentations yesterday, for example, around community-driven archives, where you've got real complex considerations for those individuals and communities that want to share or don't want to share different aspects of their archives. Chris, anything? I mean, I love the way that you said, let's make it, where we can, let's make it as simple as possible. Any reflections on the evidence around that?
Well, I mean, just two things from going through the process, and again from having worked in the sector for a long time. This question has become deeply thorny over a long period of time, and I think really we need to take the heat out of it, and that's in a way the intention behind the way we've presented this, which is that openness, wherever it can be, has to be the aspiration, recognising also it is a path to openness, it's a process to get there, but recognising also some of the massive constraints in different collections types. Moving image collections particularly, lots and lots of very thorny, complex copyright challenges barely begun to be addressed, places in different archives. So I think as long as we recognise the diversity and complexity of collections, recognise that openness is the best policy, but they have to get there, and that in some cases getting there might be a work of a long period of time, then I think we can, as I said, take the kind of political heat out of it and make it a kind of shared endeavour to work towards.
Thank you, Chris. Right, I've got a few words of wrap up before I introduce our closing speaker, but I wanted to just check, anybody want to have a go of what they're going to do next after?
We're certainly going to continue the relationships that we've grown through this process and continue the conversation. We are really well aligned with the recommendations, so we're delighted to be able to continue to be working in partnership and to be one of the organisations within the community of the TANK recommendations.
Tom?
I guess just to reiterate that point around advocacy and I guess from a leadership piece, there's many of you are DCMS arm's length bodies, or there's kind of interesting funding relationships. There's no guarantee. I can't guarantee any funding in the kind of broadest sense, but I guess to make sure that these conversations and to ensure this is being discussed, certainly at the kind of chief scientific advisor level, or when we're talking about kind of R&D investment. So to make sure that this is, like I said, this is not a nice to have. This is a core funding for culture and heritage for the UK.
And we're looking forward to promoting this with our global community. This is, I think, is a very nice experimentation in how we can approach these very complex questions. And as CC's ambit is international, I'd be delighted to be able to promote this and set this as an example to follow.
I was going to say something similar, because I'm going to sort of take this and wave this around in our heritage body partners in Europe and say, look, what from this could we now collaborate and work together on?
I feel I should say something on this, but I just want to check anybody else want to add?
A very quick thing. What I need to do next, and what I have all the other heads of the IROs need to do, and other people here, to get to where we were, we started on this in 2017. It's taken a lot of people, most of us who've never really knew very much about digital before any of this started, to take this further. We heard about the cathedral analogy early this morning. We need now to engage you in this audience to be the advocates and to work with us and to work with Rebecca. And yes, it will mean making a business case, which I know some people don't like the idea, but we need you all now to be there to take this forward to the next 5, 10, 15 years. Thank you.
I'd agree with that, and as somebody that was on that journey when I was at Rowley's place of residence, the British Library, I could see it was not going to be a short journey, but what's the phrase? A journey starts with the first step. I think we're way beyond the first step now, and I think we need to start at least jogging rather than walking. I want to just say a bit more officially that AHRC remains committed to the vision of this programme. This is the start as well for us in terms of where we want to go next. And as you heard from Christopher Smith's video message yesterday, we cannot and should not do that alone. We need the organisations who hold collections, along with the funders and other decision makers, to work together to make this happen. And I think we can see that the recommendations on the way forward to achieve this now are in place. And I look forward also to more of the technical and practice approaches that the discovery projects will be reporting on towards the end of the programme. I'd like to specifically, again, as Rowley echoed earlier, really thank Rebecca Bailey and the TANK team, as it were, but also the many project partners in the and leaders, research leaders in the audience that we've got with us and have contributed to the conference today. And I hope you will continue to engage with us as we build a case for that future investment. So before I introduce our last speaker, can you give the panel a round of applause, please?